G'day chaps, 'tis I, ClownPuncher139. By far my biggest rants against Sin's channels came during their first bout at the Arkham Saga, Arkham Asylum. Those were some of the worst everything wrong with videos I've ever seen, so I only find it right to do their job better and correct them. Being the first in the saga, Arkham Asylum should naturally have the least things wrong. Well, let's find out if that's true. Here is everything actually wrong with Batman Arkham Asylum. Starting with the obvious one final time, the bosses are terrible. There's no denying that Arkham Asylum has one of the worst boss lineups in video game history. Now, I'm not talking about Scarecrow and Killer Croc, because as far as I'm concerned, they are not on the same level as the rest of the bosses. While I obviously consider them bosses in the grand scheme of the series, in the case of Arkham Asylum, they really aren't. They're more like really elaborate levels that happen to have insta-kill enemies guarding everything. The actual bosses are all the Titans, Bane included, Poison Ivy, and Titan Joker. And yeah, they all suck. As standalone bosses, the Titans are honestly fine. If they only had one or maybe two of the Titan fights in the game, I don't think we'd criticize them as much. They would be really simple, but would just be a quick distraction before getting right back to the story. However, the fact that they show up basically any time something significant happens in the story, including really weak versions in Scarecrow's nightmares, they just become really tedious. But at the same time, there's a surprising sense of progression to all the fights. First comes the Prototype Titan, which just acts as a basic introduction to the concept, but literally dies before it can kill you, unfortunately taking away any challenge. And then there's Bane, which is a pretty fine fight on its own. There's a lot of unique factors to Bane, specifically the fact that you can't ride on his back, he heals if you don't attack him enough, he throws chunks out of the wall, and you can only damage him by slamming into the wall rather than actually being able to punch him. Furthermore, he introduces thugs into the mix, expanding on the Prototype fight by adding enemies. Also, he actually has some personality compared to the mindless screams of the regular Titans. This is definitely the biggest difficulty spike in the game for new players, and makes sure you're really ready to push forward. Then there's the Twin Titans, which take away all the enemies but force you to take on two Titans at once. Furthermore, it introduces the back rides, allowing you to smack them into one another for free damage. Then there's the Sewer Titan, which reintroduces thugs but strips it down to a single Titan while adding in electric fences for instant knockouts. It's also in a much more confined space than Bane and has a lot more enemies, creating a more difficult challenge. And lastly, there's the Guard Titans, which is the final culmination of all the challenges so far. It's a relatively wide space, but you're now dealing with a lot of enemies and two Titans. There's a lot of smart progression to these battles despite being relatively shallow fights in isolation. They all build on each other in unique ways that can create pretty fun fights if you just look at them at a glance. That said, they're all incredibly repetitive. Wait for the enemy to scream, throw a batarang, dive to the side, punch it, repeat. If there was just the slightest variation in that formula, I don't think we'd criticize them so much. But because it's that same process over and over and over and over again, with that incredibly long slowdown effect every time you just throw a batarang, it just becomes boring and tedious. If they gave you the option to, say, use the Bat Claw or Explosive Gel a little bit, that would make for a lot more fun of a fight. Use the gel like the speedrunners do, place it on the ground as a trap for the Titans to walk over and stun them. Use the Bat Claw to create wires that trip them if they walk over it. Or, for crying out loud, use something other than the Batarang for just one boss. That's what makes these fights seem lesser than they really are. They're all unique in theory, it's just that the takedown method is always the same. Poison Ivy is often cited as the best boss in Asylum, if you take Scarecrow and Croc out of the conversation. And honestly, as the years have gone by, I've come to completely disagree. All you do is run back and forth avoiding the exact same attacks for 5 freaking minutes, occasionally throwing a batarang to damage Ivy. This wouldn't be so bad if Ivy had even the tiniest bit of variety in her attacks, but all she does is stab the ground to grow vines and shoot spores at you. And even then, she doesn't even switch up which ones she uses between phases. She will only use vines or only use spores, creating one of the most boring and tedious bosses in the entire series. It gets kind of interesting in Phase 2 since she adds some enemies for you to fight and her attacks have kind of sped up by this point, but it just takes so long to get to that point that it just seems like the worst decision to beef up the length of the fight by adding 2 phases. Yes, you can speed it up a bit by throwing batarangs during the vine phase, but it does so little damage that you end up just spamming the trigger like a madman for basically nothing. And of course, how can we talk about bosses without discussing Titan Joker? I've seen people defending this fight in recent times, but there's just no way I can do the same. Here's a really simple breakdown of why this fight still sucks. 1, it's a complete waste of a concept. They created this crazy, weird design for a monster Joker, then just relegated him to the background while he makes you fight some thugs. Yes, this is in line with Joker's personality, making you fight thugs while he just sits in the back makes sense, but it doesn't make for a fun fight. Especially when you can avoid Joker's very few attacks by just running in a circle. 2, actually fighting him is a complete joke, and a painful one at that. All you do is use the Ultra Back Claw when he turns his back, which wouldn't be so bad if it weren't a ridiculously painful mashing game to pull him down. I hate mashing as much as the next guy, and this is particularly painful. Furthermore, when you actually do pull him down, he only takes 3 punches to lose a full third of his health bar. That is an embarrassment to this giant monster when all the other Titans took so much more abuse. And 3, we see the exact same concept done infinitely times better in Arkham City. All the right concepts are there, they just completely flubbed the execution. Joker throwing in presents with bombs and weapons is perfectly in line with him and adds a lot of fun and personality to this fight. Joker's commentary is hilarious, and the small space with the electric fence creates a tough combat challenge. The music is perfectly in line with Joker and is probably the best part of this fight. Honestly, if they just took the Titan out of Joker, this would probably be a pretty fun fight, maybe even considered a good final boss for Arkham Asylum. Oh wait! We have that in Arkham City, in a little section called Joker's Funhouse. You've got regular old Joker amongst his thugs, with a few beefed up enemies thrown in to make things more difficult, plus environment hazards that both add to the difficulty and personality. If they did that all for Arkham Asylum, I don't think we'd be criticizing it as much as we do. In the end, bosses aren't necessarily bad, they just took the slightest wrong steps that made them look bad in comparison to the rest of the series. If they gave us more methods to deal with Titans than just batarangs, they would be really interesting bunch of enemies that would evolve as the game progressed and put your skills to the test. If they made Ivy a little shorter and made better use of combining her attacks, she wouldn't be as tedious and would actually be worth considering the best fight in the game. If they took the Titan out of Joker or actually turned him into a threat that methodically attacked you instead of just standing back and letting thugs do all the work, we wouldn't consider him one of the worst finales to a game ever. All the bosses are on the cusp of being good, great even, but they took just the smallest missteps that, honestly, they probably couldn't have implemented even if they wanted to. As we pretty much all know by now, Asylum's bosses were a last-minute addition. While it's up in the air which bosses specifically were thrown in, I'm decently confident that Joker was the only one initially there. You need a final boss, and Joker is the most unique aside from Ivy, so it would make sense that he's the only one they made in the base game. That means that all the Titans and probably Ivy were thrown in while everything else was pretty much done. Not only did they have to adjust the story to fit some of them in, but they needed to create all of these unique fight situations with very little time left. Considering that, they did a pretty damn good job. As I said, all the Titans are pretty unique and have an evolution to them, and Ivy at least looks really cool. They put in all this work for last-minute additions and, in my opinion, did a pretty good job. While the bosses are definitely the weakest part of Asylum, they still clearly had a lot of thought and care put into them, despite being last-minute additions. They should be criticized, yes, but they should also be given a lot more slack than we've been giving them over the years. I know firsthand that last-minute crunch is terrible, so seeing that they were able to put all of this amazing stuff in, Honestly, I'm just impressed. The thug aesthetics are way too limited. One of the few sins I agreed with in those videos is that the thug models and voice lines are all way too distinctive and limited. There are probably 4 thug models in the whole game. That wouldn't be so bad if they didn't also make them so distinct from one another. You've got bald white guy, shirtless black guy, spiked mohawk guy, stitched head guy, and that's about it. These guys are all way too distinct from one another, and they're all you fight. Simultaneously, the voice lines are all we used way too much. I heard, "Where are you?" so many times growing up, it's ingrained in my mind for the rest of my life. They didn't record nearly enough lines for the thugs to make them sound anything but generic. This was something they thankfully learned from in subsequent games as they made models less distinct from one another and therefore more generic, while also expanding factions. This created a better illusion that you weren't fighting the same guy multiple times in a single room. They also expanded on voice lines, not only giving them more lines, but a lot more voices. This wouldn't have been a problem if they just made the thugs less distinct from one another. Take out the spiked mohawk guy in particular, and the thugs are a little harder to distinguish. The only aspect of the story I can really criticize, besides Titan Joker of course, is the final side arc of the game, the Pump Room arc. The overall pacing of this game is really tight, and nothing feels like a forced side quest aside from the Pump Room. After carefully navigating Croc's lair and getting Ivy's spores, Batman makes it his mission to get back up to the surface, logically to stop Ivy from destroying the whole island. But as he's climbing up, he suddenly sees Titan flowing through the sewer system, and now this is suddenly part of Joker's plan, even though it was originally to march into Gotham with an army of Banes. Okay. It feels more than a little bit like the game is trying to pad the runtime, especially since all that comes of it is a single combat encounter, a single Predator encounter, and a single boss, which any moderately competent player will probably beat in less than 20 minutes. This honestly just didn't need to exist. It doesn't add anything to the plot except a few funny moments from Joker and the thugs, and doesn't expand the lore in any way, shape, or form. We could have just gone straight to Ivy and basically nothing would have changed. But if they really needed this set piece in these encounters, they could have just given the simple reason that the normal way up is blocked and we need to activate the pumps to get the doors open. Heck, the way is already blocked by Ivy's plants, so we have to go through this route anyway. They didn't need to add Joker pumping the Titan waste into the sewers when the simple fact that their way is blocked was more than enough and was usually the way to get us to go certain places throughout the rest of the game. This is the only Arkham game with a really lacking post-game. Now, I'm not harping on the game for the lack of side content. It's really small, so there's very little side stuff I could see being implemented that would also flow with the story. However, once you complete the main story, the whole island just kinda dies. There is literally nothing to do after defeating Joker except collect all the Riddler stuff and interview tapes. That would be fine if the island still felt like it was overrun. You know how in every subsequent game, revisiting old areas would still have enemies so it didn't feel like you were running through an empty city completely devoid of life? Asylum just doesn't do that. Once you clear an area, the enemies just disappear, and there's no way to fight them again except through challenge maps. It makes the whole post-game seem really barren, and much less fun to play through than the other games. It doesn't help that Riddler is at his weakest in Asylum, with some of the most effortless trophies and riddles being the hardest to find in the game. While completing the other games, you still have enemies to fight even if they aren't part of the mission. It keeps the world alive and gives you some humor with some of their quips. Asylum just doesn't have that, which is unfortunate when it also has the most dynamic world in the saga. So seeing it reduced to a barren wasteland after taking down Joker is really unfortunate. And honestly, that's all I got, chaps. There is so little you can criticize in Arkham Asylum because the whole game is just so unbelievably solid. The only way you can criticize it is by comparing it to the other games, which, if you know anything about me, I absolutely hate. Yeah, the combat is the weakest of the series, but it's not only the game that literally created the incredible free flow system, it's also still better than like 90% of all melee combat systems across gaming. Yeah, the Predator is limited compared to the wide variety of options you have in later entries, but that ultimately helps the game stand out. It makes Batman feel that much more underpowered in Asylum compared to the other games, and forces the player to get the most creative with their limitations. Yeah, the story isn't as grandiose as we've come accustomed to, but it's still really solid, aside from that one deviation in the pump room, flows really well, and has some of the best Batman-Joker interactions in the series. There is so little you can complain about in Arkham Asylum, because to do so, you must compare it to what came later. Treating it as its own game, it's just plain excellent. And that brings up something I've wanted to talk about for some time, but never really had the full video motivation to do. Everyone loves Arkham Asylum. People have their gripes with every entry in the series. Some despise Arkham Knight for its disjointed gameplay and story, some despise Arkham City because the story wasn't satisfying to them and they liked the more atmospheric feel of Asylum, and some despise Arkham Origins because they haven't given it a second chance yet. But I challenge you to find a single person with anything bad to say about Arkham Asylum. Very rarely will you find it at the bottom of someone's ranking, and when that rarity is the case, it's just because they love the other games that much more, not out of any malice to Asylum. You could say we're just giving it the benefit of being the first game, so we have to go easy on it. But I don't think so. Everything in Arkham Asylum is just that good. The story is simple but effective, like a really drawn-out episode of the animated series. It has great pacing, great characters, great set pieces, great everything. The gameplay was revolutionary for the time, and still feels just as good to play through today. There's a reason they have barely changed anything across all 4 games aside from minor quality of life changes and additions to the already diverse moveset. And even today, the limitations that Asylum puts on you create a fun challenge to go back to after the ridiculous updates the later entries introduced. While a majority of the bosses are kinda subpar, not only were they thrown in last minute to give certain story points a much needed punctuation, but the level-based bosses are some of the best in the entire franchise. You could try criticizing the lacking models and voice acting, but considering the fact that this is a very small game and said limitations are only on characters you spend the entire game beating up, it's more than forgivable. The most you could genuinely criticize in Arkham Asylum is the lacking post-game. But the post-game was never meant to be the focus of Asylum, it was the main story. And seeing as this was just the baseline post-game that would be significantly improved upon in every subsequent game, it's hardly a gripe to have. Batman Arkham Asylum is the most beloved game in the saga because it's just that damn good. There's a reason it revolutionized the superhero genre at a time when they were absolute poison for the gaming industry. It was incredibly rare to find a good one that wasn't Spider-Man, and even they had some stinkers every now and again. Arkham Asylum showed what a superhero game was capable of, and is still an incredible piece of art. It gave us an incredible combat system that most games still attempt to copy to this day. It gave us a unique story while bringing back classic voice actors that people of all ages had grown up with. It had incredible environmental storytelling with a dynamic world that really changed as you progressed. It was genuinely scary, with incredible elements of horror sprinkled throughout every set piece, which led to some amazing bosses. And most importantly, say it with me now, it made you feel like Batman. Beating the living daylights out of thugs 1 minute while sticking to the shadows and terrifying them another. Picking them off one by one, then redirecting their punches right back into their faces. Cracking bones and stringing them up by their feet. This is Batman. This is Arkham Asylum. I'm not claiming it's the best, or even my favorite in the series, but without question, it is easily the most beloved. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later, chaps.